Hunter Biden is under federal investigation for his China dealings. The FBI goes after China's fox hunters in the US. And a Chinese spy gets up close and very personal with US politicians. Then more on this week's China News headlines. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell, and these are this week's China News headlines. We've learned that U.S. federal prosecutors have opened a criminal investigation into Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, which focuses on his business dealings in China. Investigators have been examining multiple financial issues, including whether Hunter Biden and his associates violated tax and money laundering laws in business dealings in foreign countries, principally China. And apparently, the investigation began as early as 2018. Now, this might not be a huge surprise to some of you, if you remember how, just a couple months before the presidential election, the Republican-led Senate Finance and Homeland Security Committees published this report about Hunter Biden and his shady dealings in China and Ukraine. The September report said there exists a vast web of corporate connections and financial transactions between and among the Biden family and Chinese nationals. But the report was barely mentioned in most mainstream media at the time. And then, when even more explosive stories came out about Hunter Biden's business deals, including the laptop story from the New York Post, non-conservative media didn't even cover those, or they claimed they were a far-right smear campaign. According to Project Veritas, CNN actively suppressed the story.
The Hunter Biden story was an explosive blow against Joe Biden leading up to the presidential election. But listen on this 9 a.m. editorial conference call at CNN how President Jeff Zucker chooses to not cover this important story.
So why is CNN reporting on the federal investigation into Hunter Biden now? Well, activity in the investigation had gone covert in recent months due to Justice Department guidelines prohibiting overt actions that could affect an election. Okay, I can understand the Justice Department's argument, and I'm sure CNN also wouldn't want potentially shady China connections to affect the election. Unless, of course, those shady China connections might involve Trump. Of course, if Joe Biden becomes president, I somehow don't think he'll want federal prosecutors to continue the investigation into his son. And in the event of any more Hunter Biden sex tapes being released, don't worry. I'll be sure to have Matt watch them for us, after he's done recovering from the last one. Not all heroes wear capes. But now for some good news. Europe might be finally standing up to the Chinese Communist Party. That's a big deal. Germany has been quite soft on China in the past. There's a lot of German corporate interests in China. I talked about that on a recent episode, Germany's China problem. But this week, the EU adopted landmark legislation called the EU Global Human Rights Sanctions Regime. It's kind of a clunky name, but it's important. It's basically their Global Magnitsky Act. Okay, that's also a clunky name. Anyways, here's what it does. According to a press release, the EU is equipping itself with a framework that will allow it to target individuals, entities, and bodies, including state and non-state actors, responsible for, involved in, or associated with serious human rights violations and abuses worldwide, no matter where they occurred. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo congratulated the EU on the legislation. Meanwhile, lawmakers in France are working on new legislation aimed at forced organ harvesting in China.
French daily newspaper Le Monde, The World, recently reported that over 60 French MPs questioned the origin of organs used in transplant operations in China and proposed a bill in September aimed at more transparency and scientific cooperation between French and Chinese medical institutes. When the French Minister of Health said there was no need for new legislation, Frédéric Dumas-Zajdela, member of the French National Assembly, responded, "The precautionary principle must apply if French institutions do not have the means to verify what Chinese hospitals are doing. Otherwise, what are ethical principles for?"
Of course, the EU can create a legal framework that allows governments to address human rights abuses in China. But the question will be whether they actually use those tools. Hopefully, they'll use their legal tools the same way the U.S. has been going after the Chinese Communist regime, which I'll get to in a moment. Welcome back. The U.S. has sanctioned another 14 Chinese officials over the ongoing crackdown in Hong Kong. The officials are all members of the Standing Committee of China's National People's Congress. In other words, the U.S. is sanctioning a bunch of China's NPCs. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said in a statement about the sanctions, these individuals and their immediate family members will be barred from traveling to the United States. Their assets within the jurisdiction of the United States or in the possession or control of U.S. persons will be blocked, and U.S. persons are generally prohibited from dealing with them. For more on U.S. sanctions on Hong Kong, check out my previous episode, Hong Kong's Rich Corrupt Elite Are Screwed. The U.S. House of Representatives has also just passed the Hong Kong People's Freedom and Choice Act of 2020. Basically, it provides temporary refuge in the United States for Hong Kongers who fear going back to Hong Kong because of political repression. Here's Democratic Representative Tom Malinowski.
We are saying, by passing this legislation, something very, very important to the Chinese government. We're saying if you crush Hong Kong, you will lose its best and brightest citizens, the people responsible for its vitality, for we will let them come to the United States and contribute to our vitality instead.
The bill still has to go through the Senate and be signed by the President to become law. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is also speaking out for Hong Kong pro-democracy activists being detained in Hong Kong. Following the jailing of Hong Kong activists Joshua Wong, Ivan Lam, and Agnes Chow last week, Pompeo said, "The use of courts to silence peaceful dissent is a hallmark of authoritarian regimes, and underscores once again that the Chinese Communist Party's greatest fear is the free speech and free thinking of its own people." A few days later, the State Department once again put China on a blacklist of religious freedom violators. Pompeo also announced sanctions on Chinese officials tied to China's United Front, who have engaged in malign activities to co-opt and coerce those who oppose Beijing's policies. In another State Department statement, he says the CCP's United Front Work Department funds and supports overseas organizations to spread propaganda and coerces and bullies those who would oppose Beijing's policies. The United Front frequently intimidates members of academia, businesses, civil society groups, and Chinese diaspora communities. And if the bullying doesn't work, they'll show them videos of baby pandas until their eyeballs melt. Stupid pandas. Speaking of intimidating the Chinese diaspora, the FBI is warning state and local police about China targeting people on U.S. soil. This FBI bulletin warns of China's Fox Hunt program. Operation Fox Hunt targets Chinese individuals living in the United States and other countries for alleged crimes committed under Chinese law, and seeks to repatriate them to China to face charges. So the FBI warns U.S. law enforcement not to help Chinese agents. Amazing that needs to be said. And that's important because not everyone in the U.S. is so on board with standing up to the Chinese Communist Party. According to a State Department fact sheet, U.S. investors are funding the Chinese Communist Party. Chinese stocks that are blacklisted by the Pentagon are on the U.S. stock market. Pension funds are being invested in China. A lot of this money goes to Chinese companies with military links. But hey, if you make some money, isn't it okay to sell out your country just a little? Which is why China is saying it's open to a reset in relations under a Biden administration. Senator Tom Cotton says America's corporate leaders have been in bed with China. A horrifying thought.
Many American businesses are effectively lobbyists for communist China. That needs to stop. They need to recognize that America should come first, not their profits.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. Is Senator Cotton saying businesses should be loyal to the country above money? That's communism! Thanks for the message, Comrade Cotton. I'm just kidding. Communism is about being loyal to the Communist Party, not the country. Anyway, in case you missed it, we just did an episode about how Wall Street companies are selling out to the Chinese Communist Party. I highly recommend it. A Chinese professor working in the U.S. pleaded guilty to stealing technology for Huawei. Another Chinese researcher pleaded guilty to charges related to smuggling cancer research from Harvard to China. And a suspected Chinese spy targeted politicians in California and elsewhere in the US. The woman is a Chinese national named Fang Fang. Her English name is Christine Fang. According to Axios, through campaign fundraising, extensive networking, personal charisma, and romantic or sexual relationships with at least 2 Midwestern mayors, Fang was able to gain proximity to political power, according to current and former U.S. intelligence officials and one former elected official. One of her most significant targets was Democratic California Representative Eric Swalwell. He sits on the House Intel Committee. As federal investigators became more alarmed about Fang's network, they actually alerted Swalwell to her activities. Swalwell then cut off all ties to her, according to Axios. When Fang first met Swalwell, he was just a city council member. Wow, they both look like they're in high school. After Swalwell got into Congress, Fang helped fundraise for his re-election bid and even got an intern placed into his D.C. office. Fang ended up leaving the country in 2015 after the FBI started investigating her. As Axios says, the case demonstrates China's strategy of cultivating relationships that may take years or even decades to bear fruit. The Chinese Communist Party knows that today's mayors and city council members are tomorrow's governors and members of Congress. Well, you know, the YouTubers of today might be tomorrow's used car salesmen. So China, if you're looking for a deal, you might want to give me a ring. In another Axios story, Joe Biden might be thinking of making Pete Buttigieg the ambassador to China. I can imagine top communist officials being absolutely thrilled with having to attend galas and events with Pete and his husband. And now it's time for my weekly catchphrase. Hong Kong police have arrested more democracy advocates. I have to say that every week, but it's not the catchphrase I want to be known for. The 8 people this week were arrested for attending an unauthorized protest this past summer. They include the former lawmaker known as Longhair, who I interviewed when I was in Hong Kong. You know, I've interviewed a lot of people who have now been arrested in Hong Kong. I hope there's no connection, but if there is, my only regret is that I never got to interview Chief Executive Carrie Lam. And coming up after the break, how the Chinese regime is using big data to figure out who to arrest next. Welcome back. A new report by Human Rights Watch reveals how China is using big data to arrest Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. Some of the things that could get someone sent to a detention center include having a long beard or using Skype, or being born after the 1980s. Isn't missing out on the 80s punishment enough? You could also be detained for just being generally untrustworthy, whatever that means. I'm starting to see how they were able to lock up millions of people. Another report says that Huawei, together with one of China's biggest AI firms, MEGV, are building a facial recognition system specifically targeting Uyghurs. I assume the system can directly identify whether someone is an ethnic Uyghur by what their face looks like. It's easy. If the camera spots a person walking down the street looking terrified, they're a Uyghur. Speaking of Huawei, don't you think it's so unfair that the US is talking about banning it? In unrelated news, China has blocked more than 100 foreign apps, including TripAdvisor. I assume TripAdvisor is blocked because of their annoying pop-up ads. And now, I'm afraid I have some really tragic news. Hu Xijin, the editor-in-chief of my favorite Chinese state-run media, the Global Times, may be mired in a sex scandal. I'm sure you're as broke up about it as I am. He allegedly had extramarital affairs with 2 female subordinates and had illegitimate children with them. Wow. This guy got 2 female subordinates to sleep with him? This guy? Are we sure there isn't some Me Too stuff going on here? But the complaint didn't come from his baby mamas. The complaint actually came from the deputy editor-in-chief of Global Times, Duan Jingtao. She apparently reported Hu Xijin to the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection. That's the group that has helped Xi Jinping purge more than 1 million officials. Hu Xijin says that Duan Jingtao coveted his editor-in-chief position and that she has been absent from work for a long time and is delusional suggesting that the whistleblower is mentally ill. That's what I love about Hu Xijin. He's classy, just like the Global Times. And it's finally Christmas season, so why not send the gift of annoying the Chinese Communist Party? If you remember, China has detained 2 Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, for almost 2 years. It's in retaliation for Canada detaining Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou. And while Meng is accused of actual crimes, violating U.S. sanctions on Iran, the 2 Michaels are really just victims of the CCP's hostage diplomacy. And now, there's a special Christmas-time campaign to help them. The idea is simple. Write a holiday card with encouraging words to either Kovrig or Spavor, address the card to the Chinese ambassador in the embassy or consulate nearest to them, and then post a picture of the card on social media using the hashtag #FreeChinaHostages. Here's my Christmas card. So please, join me in wishing the 2 Michaels a very Merry Christmas. And now, let's hear from one of you, a fan who supports China Uncensored on the crowdfunding website Patreon. Christian B. Unger says, "I'd like to see you take over The Daily Show, putting all the incompetent and unfunny crew on the unemployment line." Well, Christian, I can't say I've been watching The Daily Show over the past few years. I didn't really make the Trevor Noah transition. Obviously, The Daily Show, at least in its heyday under Jon Stewart, was a big influence when I started China Uncensored. But I'll actually share a story with you I've never told before. I actually met Jon Stewart once at a movie theater here in New York. This was back when he was still hosting The Daily Show, and back when we could still go to movie theaters. There was a small group of people around him, and I wasn't going to say anything to him, but a friend of mine encouraged me to, and he was absolutely lovely. Very friendly, didn't blow me off. I told him a bit about China Uncensored, which I had just started, and he said it sounded like a great idea. And he was right. Thanks, Christian. We're in an information war with the Chinese Communist Party, and knowledge is the best weapon. YouTube has been hitting us with demonetization a lot again, so help us in our fight to bring truthful, uncensored information about China to the world. Join the China Uncensored 50-cent army on Patreon, and for as little as $1 an episode, you can help us keep up the fight. And you'll be able to ask me questions I might answer on the show. Visit patreon.com/ChinaUncensored to join. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.